Hello everyone, I'm Wendell Jones and welcome to this edition of the program Jones and Company. On this program we examine national issues. In July of 2013, the Prime Minister of the Bahamas established a task force on gender-based violence. And many Bahamians would know of the incidents of violence in our country and the extent to which many people have been killed. And so on our program today, we are going to discuss violence in a general way, but particularly gender-based violence. Our guests on the program today are Mrs. Rubie Nottage, who is a co-chair of the task force, and she's joined today by Dr. Dillet, who is a forensic psychiatrist. It's our pleasure to have them both here today. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Jones.
We had a discussion on radio some time ago with your other co-chair, Dr. Robin Roberts, and it was quite an interesting discussion.
Yes.
And I'm sure we're going to have an interesting discussion today.
Exactly.
Yes. Tell us about the establishment of the task force now and why it was necessary.
Right. The task force, Mr. Jones, was established by the Prime Minister as long ago as July of 2013. And at that time, apparently, it was brought to the Prime Minister's attention by another one of our co-chairs, who is Dr. Sandra Dean Patterson. And as you know, Dr. Patterson is a legend in the Bahamas as far as advocacy for women and against domestic violence. And Dr. Sandra Dean Patterson apparently presented to the Prime Minister some serious statistics and some serious conversation about the deepening violence that's happening with respect to women in our country. And he then said, all right, let's form a task force and explore both the breadth of this problem and some of the ways in which it can be eradicated. So that's really the vision or objective of the task force that was formed at the Prime Minister's command, as it were. I think it's a timely initiative. As we've gone through the past few months from September when we actually began, we've seen an escalation of violence, not only locally, but internationally against women. And so the world has already drawn its attention to this issue of gender-based violence, or violence against women.
But are you concentrating on violence against women when you talk about gender-based violence, or you're talking about violence against the individual? Because there are some men who complain about violence as well, and violence being inflicted by women.
You're quite right, and it is not limited to women. In fact, it's not just limited to men and women, it's boys, children, girls, everyone. Anything in which one gender is specifically isolated and violently treated. And perhaps I could turn to Dr. Dillet and ask him to give us what is a generally accepted definition of gender-based violence, because it is encompassing and all-inclusive.
That would be helpful.
Well, certainly. Thank you, Mrs. Nottage. Violence in general is to inflict harm or the threat of harm against an individual, a group, or a community. Gender-based violence is where it's directed, generally speaking, because of one's gender. But as Mrs. Nottage adequately said, it can be both female, male, or child. It doesn't have to be just female. But there are different types of gender-based violence, and I think that's very important to discuss as well. There's, of course, physical violence, which most people would be alert to, but there's also sexual violence, mental and emotional violence, but also harmful traditional practices that are also a big part of many different cultures, and also socioeconomic violence as well. All of those comprise what is called gender-based violence. And these terms are interchangeable with violence against women, sexual violence, things of that nature. So it does encompass many, many different forms and many, many different types of people.
Have we developed, or are we developing, a culture of violence in our country?
Go ahead.
I believe we certainly are, and we are not alone. This is a worldwide problem. If we speak specifically to females, worldwide statistics says that 1 in 3 women will be subject to abuse, coercion to have sex, or in some way physically assaulted. 1 in 5 women will be raped or attempted to be raped in their lifetime. That is just perspective of how significant this problem is around the world. It's not only the Bahamas, but certainly in the Bahamas it's a significant problem that we need to address.
I'd like to talk about it in the light of our Bahamian culture. I believe that we're not just developing. This has been endemic in our culture. And it is something that we have learnt, and each child coming through our cultural environment learns it. And that's why I'm convinced it can be unlearned. Now, why do I say it's a part of our culture? I think that our culture is based very strongly on male patriarchy. You know, the man is the person who is supposed to do X or Y or Z. And often the female has been very, very subservient to this general picture. But in doing that, there has been tremendous undercurrents of learned behavior with respect to how do you treat women. And so when I speak about gender-based violence and the cultural violence that we see in the Bahamas, I speak mostly about the violence exhibited to women by male positioning, masculinity, if I can call it that way. And I think that that is peculiar to cultures such as ours and very, very similar throughout the Caribbean.
Could it be that we have the problem in the society, as Mrs. Nottage said, it's learned behavior, Dr. Dillet. It was a long time ago when men believed that they should control the home, that they were in charge of the home. And then came along the whole feminine movement. Well, many years ago, the women's liberation movement, and women just felt that they should be exerting certain controls as well. Could it be that women have moved out of where they used to be in the society, in the home?
Well, I think there's some value to those comments. What I will say is that the way that we react with one another, no matter what the gender, is more violent than it used to be. As a culture, we are evolving towards dealing with our troubles, dealing with our tribulations in a violent or aggressive manner. So it's not only women. Now, if you want to look at another way of looking at it, let's look at the civil rights movements. If someone feels disenfranchised, they will seek to become franchised. If someone feels as if they are being unfairly treated, they will seek both legal and political means to get empowerment. And that is certainly what is happening, I think, with our female population. They are simply tired of being abused, and everyone should be, and that goes for everyone, whether it's race, whether it's religion, whether it's gender. When you feel disenfranchised, when you feel abused, you are going to fight back. You have to fight back to survive. I believe that's what's happening now.
Yeah, but you know, men would say to women, you should know your place.
Yes, but that was the case.
Yes.
Nowadays, the emphasis is on human rights.
Yes.
And the fact that every human being has a place, and a place of respect, and a place in which bodily protection is ensured by constitutions, by laws. And hence we have a law that does say very specifically that gender-based violence or domestic violence is against the law. And so there's nothing that a man can say or a father can say to his child that you deserve this punishment or you deserve to be beaten until you're bloody and bruised. That is against human rights.
Yes.
That's the issue that has come about these days.
But when you are in a culture, Mrs. Nottage, where many men, because of their religious beliefs and certain biblical views, believe that they are the prince of the house and the man is the head of the house as Christ is the head of the church, and he seeks to exert his authority
Yes.
in the home. And when he finds that there is someone is rebelling against what he's seeking to do, then you are bound to have violence, right?
Well, you're almost feeding into what Dr. Dillet said. Whenever you feel that you have something that you have as of right. Now, I would question whether that is as of right, because Christ was the head of the church. But Christ served the church. He came as a servant. And therefore, sometimes, I'm going to just say this, I'm not arguing as anything other than a person who has also read the Bible. Sometimes we read the Bible to our own advantage. And when a man says, I am the head, and the Bible says I am supposed to inflict whatever I want, my right is right, that may be going a little farther than an honest interpretation of Christ's words. He was the model, and his model was that he died for the church. He served the church. In other words, he laid down his life in order to make sure that all persons were one in him, not just the male. But let's leave that. That's another argument. I'd be happy to have you take me with some of the more theologically trained persons, and we can explore that. Because it is endemic in our society that we argue from that standpoint.
Yes.
May I comment as well? I think sometimes we get sidetracked when using religious arguments. Leadership is about leadership. It is about empowerment. It is about getting productivity from those who you lead. When you do something that is abusive, we lack production. We lack empathy for each other. It is about resentment. It is about retaliation. What are we seeing in our communities now? Retaliation. How do we interact with one another in aggressive, violent tendencies? If our leaders, and if they are the men and the head of the families, you have to be able to show leadership that's also empathetic. You have to show love. You have to show understanding. As a society, the only way that we will move forward in a positive direction is if everyone feels as if they have a fair chance.
But you are seeking to revert or reverse century-old problems.
We're seeking to re-educate, yes.
Yes,
and
that is very difficult.
It's difficult, and it's a long process. It's not tomorrow. It demands patience, and it also demands leadership. And this is where the leadership, I think, particularly at least the political leadership at this moment, seems to have been properly directed. But it does demand education. It demands exactly what we're trying to do, raising the public's awareness. There are a number of younger generation coming up here. I think as a young country, a huge proportion of our population is under 30.
You are suggesting, Mrs. Nottage, that we have been a miseducated people for a very long time. And as a result of the miseducation of the Bahamian, that we have a high level of violence.
I think it's a part of our culture, yes. And I think you call it miseducation. I think it's a misinterpretation of whatever they feel was the education, the biblical principles. I think it's been a misinterpretation of that, a misapplication of it. And I think we need to get the education a little more skewed towards really seeing what is leadership, what is appropriate for this country, where all parties must contribute to its development, men, women, and children. And so to that extent, you cannot have a bruised population and hope to bring about any degree of development and advance. The posture of violence brings about tremendous trauma, bruising, resentment, really to some extent polarization of our society.
But we seem to enjoy inflicting harm, inflicting some hurt, Dr. Dillet, by the way we express ourselves. Bahamians, many of them have no difficulty, and I use this word advisedly, in cussing out somebody. And all of that is a part of violence, isn't it?
Well, certainly, violence has many forms, and certainly verbal abuse, we have to take into consideration the impact, the emotional and mental impact that has on other persons around us. I think Mrs. Nottage's point is that if we want our society to advance and to take our rightful place in the world as a country to be respected, to be emulated, we have to have a population that is moving forward. People who are battered and bruised, they're the ones who are going to miss work. They're the ones who are not going to turn up to school. Those are the persons who are either victims of violence or are witnesses of violence who will then be perpetrators of violence. And I believe our prisons and our schools, our correctional facilities are full with persons who are either the victims or who have been witnesses to various violent activities perpetrated by their parents or their family or their neighbors, etc.
We'll talk some more about it, but let's take this break here. We're on Jones and Company, and we're talking violence today, gender-based violence. We'll talk more about it. We'll take this break and come right back.